Get this man away from my car. Not, I'd like to speak with someone else. Not, I'm not sure this is working out. 5 words, spoken across the hood of a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO to a room full of people who had spent the last 40 minutes pretending not to listen, and not one of them moved. Elijah Croft didn't look up. He was lying on a creeper board beneath the front chassis, his right hand around a torque wrench, his left hand on the undercarriage in the specific way of someone who is not just touching a machine, but reading it the way a doctor's hand rests on a wrist when it's listening for something that can't be rushed. He had been under that car for 37 minutes. He had not said a word since he slid under it. He finished what he was doing. He set the torque wrench down. He rolled out on the creeper board and stood up, the way a man stands up who is in no particular hurry. He looked at Randolph Calder III. Randolph Calder III was 61 years old and worth, according to the most recent estimate that had his publicist's fingerprints on it, somewhere between $4 and $6 billion, which is the kind of number where the range itself communicates that the specifics don't much matter. He was wearing a watch that cost more than most cars in this building. He was standing on the other side of the GTO with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the way of someone who has said a thing and is waiting for the world to rearrange itself accordingly. The 4 other men in the shop, 2 restoration techs, the shop's front desk manager, and a parts vendor who had come in to drop off a delivery and had not quite managed to leave, were looking at the middle distance with the focused intensity of people who have decided that what is happening in front of them is not happening to them. Elijah looked at Randolph Calder III for a moment. He looked at the car. He set the creeper board against the wall with the deliberate care of someone putting a tool away properly, because that is how you treat tools. He said, "She'll run." Calder said, "I paid $2.3 million for this car. I am not going to trust it to someone who doesn't know what he's looking at." Elijah said nothing. "Do you hear me?" Calder said. "I want someone qualified." And Elijah Croft, who had been rebuilding engines since he was 8 years old, who had 41 years of grease under his fingernails, and a mind that could read an engine the way a musician reads, a score who had done something to that GTO in 37 minutes, that 3 other shops in 2 other, the states had failed to do in a combined 19 months, looked at Randolph Calder III and said, very quietly, "She'll run." He walked to the sink and began washing his hands. In 6 hours, in front of every person who mattered to Randolph Calder III, an engine that had not run in 4 years was going to start on the first turn of the key. And the man who had called Elijah Croft incompetent was going to drop to his knees on a concrete floor in front of 47 witnesses. Have you ever been told you didn't know what you were doing by someone who hadn't bothered to learn what you knew? Stay right here, because this story starts long before Randolph Calder III walked into this shop, and it ends somewhere he never saw coming. Let me take you back 22 years. The town of Dumas, Arkansas, sat on a flat piece of delta land 60 miles southeast of Little Rock, and the thing people who had never been there didn't understand about it was how quiet it could get. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a place that has had things taken out of it over a long time. Slowly, the way a battery loses charge, until what's left is a specific stillness that you either find your footing in or you leave. Most people left. Curtis Croft had stayed. He had run the shop on Carpenter Road for 33 years by the time Elijah was born. Not a restoration shop then. Not yet. Just a general repair garage with 2 lifts and an office that smelled like oil and old coffee, and the particular paper of receipts from a machine that printed them on a continuous roll. Curtis Croft could fix anything with an engine and a crankshaft. He had a gift for mechanical diagnosis that the people of Dumas described variously as a 6th sense, as magic, and as something the Lord put in his hands when he made him, which was the description Curtis himself would have accepted if pressed, though he would have added that the Lord expected you to work at it regardless. He had a son at 41, which surprised him, and a wife who was not surprised because she had been praying for it for 9 years. The son was Elijah. Elijah could walk at 11 months and could name the parts of a carburetor at 3, which his father taught him the way other fathers teach their children nursery rhymes, not as a lesson, just as the vocabulary of the world they lived in. By 8, Elijah was disassembling and reassembling small engines, lawnmowers, outboards, a chainsaw that had been sitting in the back of the shop for 6 years waiting for someone to have time for it. He did not do this with manuals. He did it by looking at the thing, and then looking at it again, and then listening to it, an attention so complete and unhurried that Curtis would sometimes stand in the doorway of the shop and watch his son and feel something he couldn't name exactly, which was the feeling of watching someone become what they were supposed to be. When Elijah was 12, Curtis brought home the car. It was a 1967 Shelby GT 500, and it was not much to look at. It had been sitting in a field for 11 years. The paint had oxidized to a dull rust orange under the original blue. The interior was destroyed. The engine had been pulled by a previous owner for reasons that had been lost along with the owner. It was, to the untrained eye, a carcass. It was, to Curtis Croft's eye, a project. And to Elijah's eye, to the 12-year-old who crouched in front of it in the fading delta light on a September evening and put both hands on the hood and closed his eyes, it was something that had been waiting. They worked on it for 4 years. Not every day. On Saturdays, mostly. And on summer evenings when the light lasted long enough. Curtis would teach by doing, narrating what his hands were doing in the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who had learned by watching and knew, therefore, that watching required something to look at. Elijah would watch, and then Elijah would do. Not imitate, do, which is different. Imitation is a copy. What Elijah did was understand the principle and then find his own path to it, which sometimes took him somewhere slightly different from where Curtis had arrived. And twice in 4 years took him somewhere better, at which point Curtis would stop and look at what his son had done and say, "How did you think of that?" Elijah would say he didn't think of it exactly, that it was more like the engine showed him. They finished the Shelby the summer. Elijah was 16. They drove it together on a Sunday morning in August, Curtis in the passenger seat the whole way. Elijah behind the wheel, on a 2-lane road that ran arrow straight between soybean fields for 11 miles before it hit the county line. The engine sounded like a statement, like something that had been waiting to be said for a long time. Curtis looked out the window at the fields going by. He said, "You're going to be better at this than me." Elijah didn't say anything. He drove. What Curtis Croft could not know, on that Sunday morning in August, sitting in the passenger seat of a car they had pulled from a field and rebuilt with their hands over 4 years, was that he had 11 more years. That was the length of the rest of his life. 11 years, during which Elijah would go to Lincoln University in Missouri on a merit scholarship and study mechanical engineering, and come back to Dumas and work in the shop on Carpenter Road, and begin teaching himself the specific language of classic restoration: Italian, American, British, the post-war racing machines that were engineered with a passion that bordered on recklessness and survived because of a craftsmanship that bordered on religion. 11 years, during which the name Elijah Croft would begin to travel the way names travel when someone does something that can't be explained by normal standards of reference, not through advertising, not through a website, but through the quiet, reliable network of people who own things they love and need someone they trust. 11 years, and then a Tuesday in March when Curtis Croft did not wake up, at 71 years old, in the house on Bayou Road where he had slept for 43 years. Elijah buried his father on a Saturday. On Monday, he opened the shop. He had not known, until that Monday, how much of the reason he came to work every day had been his father. He found out by arriving at the shop in the gray 6 o'clock morning and unlocking the door and turning on the lights and standing in the middle of the floor for a long time, surrounded by the smell of oil and old coffee and the particular paper of the receipt machine his father had never replaced. He stood there until something settled in him. Not grief. Leaving grief doesn't leave. It just learns where to sit. What settled was a decision, the only kind of decision that comes from grief without language, that you continue, that you do the work, that you do it the way the person who taught you did it, and you do it better, because that's the only tribute that lasts, he continued. 12 years later, the phone rang, and it was a man named Percy Elam, who restored competition-class vintage automobiles out of a facility in Memphis, and who had received Elijah's name from 3 different sources in the same month, which Percy Elam described as the universe getting insistent. Percy had a client. The client had a car. The car was a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. The Ferrari 250 GTO is, in the vocabulary of automobile collecting, not simply a car. It is the artifact that all other artifacts are measured against. 36 were built. They were built to race, They won races. They have been sold for prices that require you to say the number slowly, out loud, to confirm that it is real. They are machines in the way that a cathedral is a building, technically accurate, but missing something essential about what the thing actually is. Elijah had read about them since he was a teenager. He had studied them through manuals, through racing photographs, through a trip to Maranello he had taken at 38, with money he had saved for 6 years, specifically for the purpose of standing in front of the factory where they were made. He had never worked on one. When Percy Elam described the problem, a Colombo 512 that had not started in 4 years, that had been through 3 shops in 2 states, without resolution, that the car's current owner was beginning to regard as a permanent condition rather than a soluble problem, Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Send me the car." But here was the thing Percy Elam had not been able to tell him, because he hadn't known it himself until the transport truck was already on the road. The car was coming with the owner. Randolph Calder III arrived the morning the transport truck arrived, in a black SUV, followed by a second black SUV, which was the way he traveled everywhere, because there was always the possibility that something in the second vehicle would be needed, though what that something was had never, in Calder's recollection, been specified. He stepped out of the first SUV in a jacket that cost more than the shop's monthly lease and looked at the building on Carpenter Road with the expression of a man reassessing a decision. The building had been updated since Curtis's time, but not in a way that announced itself. New roof, new lifts, a paint job on the exterior that was clean and exact. Inside, the tools were arranged with a precision that looked less like tidiness and more like the layout of an operating room, everything where it would be needed, nothing where it wouldn't. There were photographs on the wall, engines in various states of assembly, a gold-framed certificate from a vintage automobile association, and one personal photograph, small, in the upper left corner of the arrangement, of a man and a boy standing next to a blue Shelby on a flat road between soybean fields, squinting into the sun. Calder did not look at the photographs. He looked at Elijah. He had expected, without quite forming the expectation as a thought, something different, something that matched the credential. What he saw was a man in gray coveralls who had the stillness and the quiet authority of someone who is at home in exactly the place he is standing, who looked at the GTO as it came off the transport ramp with an attention so complete it was almost intimate, who said nothing to Calder and did not extend his hand because both hands were already on the car. "Elijah Croft," Percy Elam said, appearing from behind the transport truck. "Best man in 4 states for a Colombo engine. Best man I've found anywhere for this era of car." Calder looked at Elijah. He looked at the shop. He looked at Percy. He said, "What's his background?" Percy said, "I just told you his background." Calder said, "His credentials, his training. Where did he study restoration?" Percy Elam, who had been in this business for 31 years and who had introduced a great many people to a great many things they did not initially understand. They were being given access to, said Randolph. The man fixed a 57 Maserati 250F last year that 2 Ferrari-certified shops in Europe said was irreparable. He did it in 11 days. You can ask me about his credentials, or you can let him look at your car. One of those 2 things will solve your problem. Calder looked at Elijah again. Something moved behind his eyes that was not quite a decision, more the precondition of one. He said, "Fine, but I'm staying." He stayed. For 37 minutes. He stayed. He stood on the other side of the GTO, while Elijah worked first walking the exterior of the car with both hands moving across the bodywork in long, deliberate strokes, reading it through his palms the way a blind person reads a page. Then opening the hood and leaning over the engine with the specific patience of someone having a conversation that cannot be rushed. Then sliding under the car on the creeper board and not emerging for 19 minutes. Calder lasted 22 of those 37 minutes before he said it. "Get this man away from my car." "6 hours. That was what Elijah had said, and that was the kind of statement he did not make unless he already knew the answer. He had known it at minute 11, lying under the chassis with his left hand on the block and his right hand on the torque wrench and his eyes closed, which was not the posture of someone guessing. It was the posture of someone confirming. The problem was not the engine. Or rather, the problem was not only the engine, and the reason 3 shops in 2 states had failed to find it was that they had looked where the problem was described and had not looked where the problem lived. What Elijah had found lying in the dark under the chassis of a car that had not run in 4 years, reading it through his hands like a text in a language he had been studying since he was 3 years old, was a fuel delivery issue that had its root not in the carburetors, which had been rebuilt twice by the previous shops, but in a microfracture in the fuel line where it ran behind the gearbox, invisible to inspection, unless you knew to press on the line at a specific point and feel for the faint inconsistency in the rubber, the slight softness, no larger than a thumbprint, where the structural integrity had failed. He had found it at minute 11. He had fixed it in the subsequent 26 minutes with a section of period-correct fuel line that he had in his supply because he believed in being prepared for what the car could tell you rather than what the invoice said. Needed. Then he had set the torque wrench down, rolled out, washed his hands. He said, "She'll run," and then he waited. He called Percy Elam from the office. He said, "Your client wants someone qualified. I'm going to need him to be here in 6 hours for the start." Percy said, "He's not going to apologize, you know." Elijah said, "I know," Percy said. "So why do you want him there?" Elijah said, "Because the car deserves a witness, and he's the one she belongs to." Elijah. Percy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 6 hours. 6 hours, Elijah said. Calder had not, in fact, left. He had retreated to his first SUV and had conducted 2 conference calls and eaten a lunch that his assistant had arranged to be delivered from a restaurant in Memphis, and he had at no point given any indication that he intended to go anywhere, which Elijah had understood from the moment the second SUV pulled in. Men like Calder did not leave things they owned in places they didn't trust. The leaving was a performance. The staying was the truth. Elijah spent the 6 hours doing what he always did when the diagnostic work was finished and the repair was made, and there was time before the moment of confirmation. He worked on something else. There was a 1958 Aston Martin DB2, 4 inches the second bay that needed valve work, and he worked on it with the same unhurried attention, the same listening quality of his hands, through the afternoon. He did not speak to Calder. He did not check on the GTO. The GTO was finished. There was nothing to check. At 4:47 in the afternoon, Percy Elam arrived. Behind him came 2 men Elijah didn't recognize, and then, 5 minutes later, 2 more. The men Elijah didn't recognize were, he would learn later, a vintage car journalist from a publication based in London, a collector from Nashville who had been friends with Calder for 20 years, and 2 other people whose connection to Calder and the car would become relevant later in the story. Calder climbed out of the first SUV. He looked at the shop. He looked at Elijah, who was wiping his hands on a shop rag and watching from the doorway of the second bay. "You said 6 hours, Calder said. 4:49, Elijah said. He set the shop rag down. He walked to the GTO. He opened the driver's door. He sat in the seat, which required a moment of orientation because the GTO was built for men significantly smaller than Elijah, but he found his position and settled. He looked at the ignition. He looked at the instrumentation. He put both hands on the wheel for a moment, the way you greet something before you ask it a question. The 5 men behind the car, Calder, Percy, the journalist, the Nashville collector, and the other 2 stood in a loose semicircle around the rear of the car. Elijah turned the key. The Colombo 512 started on the first turn, not the second. Not after a hesitation, not with a cough, not with the tentative, exploratory quality of an engine that is being coaxed. On the first turn, the way an engine starts when everything is right, when the fuel delivery is exactly what it should be, and the timing is where it needs to be, and the 37 years of mechanical memory in every component of that engine are aligned and ready. It started the way something starts when it has been waiting and is now, finally, allowed to do what it was built to do. The sound, the specific sound of a Colombo V12 at idle, which is not like any other engine sound in the world, and which people who have heard it in person struggle to describe to people who haven't, settling finally on words like voice and singing and alive, filled the shop on Carpenter Road in Dumas, Arkansas. It filled the 2 bays. It filled the office where Curtis Croft had drunk his coffee for 33 years. It vibrated in the metal shelving and in the glass of the framed certificate on the wall. and in the small photograph of a man and a boy on a flat road between soybean fields, squinting into the sun. Elijah sat in the seat and listened to the engine. He didn't smile. He didn't look at Calder. He listened to the engine with his eyes closed, the way his father had taught him to listen, reading it through the sound, the way he'd read it through his hands, checking, confirming, knowing. It was right. It was exactly right. It was what he had known at minute 11 under the chassis, and hearing it was not a surprise. It was a confirmation. It was the engine saying, yes. He sat for 30 seconds. Then he opened his eyes and stepped out of the car. He looked at Randolph Calder III. Calder was not where he had been. Calder was on his knees. On the concrete floor of the shop on Carpenter Road, on both knees, his hands at his sides, looking at the car, the GTO, the Colombo 512 running its perfect idle with an expression on his face that had nothing composed about it, nothing calculated. It was the expression of a man who has been broken open by something beautiful, by something he had believed was lost, by the sound of a machine he loved, returning from a place it had been for 4 years without a way home. He was crying. Randolph Calder III, $4 to $6 billion, the watch, the 2 SUVs, the crossed arms and the set jaw. He was on his knees on a concrete floor, crying, in front of Percy Elam and a journalist from London and a Nashville collector and 2 other witnesses, because an engine that had not run in 4 years was running, because Elijah Croft had done the thing he said he would do. Nobody spoke. The engine ran. The journalist from London was named William Hatch, and he had been covering vintage automobile restoration for 19 years. And he had seen a great many things in those 19 years, but had never seen anything precisely like this. He had come to Dumas at Percy Elam's invitation, skeptical in the specific way of someone who has been disappointed by promises before, and had spent the 6 hours of the afternoon in the first SUV with Calder, working on something on his laptop, emerging periodically to look at the shop building with the expression of someone recalibrating. When the engine started, William Hatch set down his laptop and walked to where he could see the car and watched for 30 seconds, and then he took out his phone and began recording. He recorded the engine. He recorded the interior of the shop. He recorded Calder on his knees. He recorded Elijah standing next to the car, with the absolute stillness that was apparently simply how he inhabited his body. He recorded for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He published the piece 3 weeks later. Not in his magazine. In addition to the magazine piece he published, he also published a written account, 8,000 words, on a platform where he had 300,000 readers, and the headline was, The Last Engine. The piece was about Elijah Croft. It was about Dumas, Arkansas, and the shop on Carpenter Road, and Curtis Croft and the Shelby GT 500, and the 4 years of Saturdays and summer evenings. It was about the 250 GTO and the Colombo 512, and the 19 months of 2 shops in 2 states, and the 37 minutes, and the microfracture behind the gearbox. It was about what it means to listen to an engine actually listen, the way Elijah's father had taught him, the way Abena had woven the patterns the men wouldn't teach her. In the vocabulary of things that take a long time to learn and longer to respect, William Hatch wrote, "What Elijah Croft does with a classic engine is not restoration. Restoration implies returning something to a previous state. What he does is closer to what a physician does with a patient who has been misdiagnosed. He goes back to the beginning. He starts from first principles, and he finds what is actually wrong and makes it actually right. He is the only person I have encountered in this field who appears to understand the engine not as an artifact to be preserved, but as a mechanism to be understood. The difference matters enormously. It is the difference between a museum and a living thing." The piece was read 340,000 times in the first week. Then someone shared it on a vintage automobile collectors forum with the note, "The Shop in Arkansas," and someone else shared that on a different platform. And the name Elijah Croft began moving through the networks in which vintage automobile collectors found the people they trusted, which are small networks and slow ones, built on referral and confirmation, and the kind of trust that is only possible between people who have loved an expensive, delicate, irreplaceable thing and needed someone else to understand what that meant. His phone rang for 3 weeks straight. He answered every call. He took notes in a green composition notebook, the same kind his father had kept by the office phone for 33 years. He scheduled what he could and recommended good people for what he couldn't. He did not raise his prices, because his prices had always been what they were, and he did not see the attention as a reason to change them. He was not interested in becoming a different kind of shop. He was interested in doing what he did. What happened to Randolph Calder III was more complicated than a simple accounting of consequences, because Calder was not a simple man, and what the Colombo 12 had done to him on the concrete floor of a shop in Dumas, Arkansas was not something he could undo by ignoring it. He had said incompetent in front of witnesses. The journalist had been one of them, and though William Hatch's piece did not use Calder's name, he was described throughout as the car's owner. In the careful way of journalists who have lawyers, anyone who knew the community knew the car and could work backward from it. The inference was not difficult. Several people made it. Several of those people said so, in the comments of the London piece, and in the collector forums where the piece was being discussed, and in that specific, quiet, devastating way that communities of people who care about things assess someone who has behaved badly in front of the thing they all care about. Calder was not cancelled, because that is not how these communities operate. He was reassessed by the people who had known him for 20 years, by the collector networks he moved in, by the boards he sat on. The reassessment was not public. It was the quiet, irrevocable kind that happens in private conversations and in the subtle recalibrations of who is included in what and who is called for which consultation. It was social, not legal. It was, in some ways, more lasting for that. He called Percy Elam 6 weeks after Dumas. Percy had been expecting the call. Percy said, "He doesn't need an apology. He has the car. You don't have anything he needs." Calder said, "I know." Percy said, "So what are you calling about?" Calder said, "I want to fund something." What Calder funded, after a conversation with Percy Elam, and then a conversation with the director of a vocational education program in Memphis, and then a conversation with the principal of Dumas High School, was a 2-year restoration apprenticeship program based at the shop on Carpenter Road. 4 students per year, selected from high schools in the Arkansas Delta region, with preference given to students from Dumas and the adjacent communities. Full stipend, materials provided, curriculum developed by Elijah Croft himself. Calder made the call from his office. He did not go back to Dumas. He did not ask for acknowledgement. The program's founding documents listed the funder as an anonymous gift. The program was named, at Elijah's request, the Curtis Croft Apprenticeship, and the enrollment document for the first cohort included, at the top of the first page, a sentence that Elijah had written himself. The purpose of this program is to teach young people to listen to the thing they are working on, which is the only skill from which all other skills in this field are derived. 4 students enrolled the first year. The oldest was 18. The youngest was 15, which required a waiver, which Elijah granted because the 15-year-old had come to his shop on a Saturday without calling ahead and had stood in the bay looking at the Aston Martin for 20 minutes without saying anything. And when Elijah finally said, "What do you see?" the kid had said without hesitating, without guessing, with the complete matter-of-fact confidence of someone who has looked at something long enough to know the valve timing's off. He was right. Elijah had given him the waiver on the spot. On the 1-year anniversary of the day the Colombo 512 started in the shop on Carpenter Road, William Hatch published a follow-up piece. He had come back to Dumas, which he described as requiring the same recalibration on the return that it had required on the first visit. The flatness of the land, the specific quiet, the way the light fell on it in the afternoon like something being laid down carefully. He wrote about the 4 apprentices. He wrote about the 15-year-old, who was now 16, and who had, in the course of the year, rebuilt 2 carburetors and a transmission, and had identified 2 diagnostic problems that Elijah said he would not have found without him. He wrote about the green composition notebook on the office phone, the same kind Curtis Croft had kept, the same position, the same worn soft cover. He wrote about the photograph on the wall, the man and the boy on the flat road between soybean fields, squinting into the sun. He wrote, at the end, "Elijah Croft once told me that his father said the engine would show him. What I understand now, having spent 2 visits and 12 months thinking about it, is that this is not a metaphor. He means it literally. He means that if you pay the right kind of attention, without assumption, without rushing, without the arrogance of believing you already know the answer before the thing has told you, the engine tells you exactly what's wrong and exactly what it needs." He learned this from his father. His father learned it from 40 years of practice. The 15-year-old in the bay learned it in 11 months. None of them were born knowing it. All of them chose to stay still long enough to hear. Elijah read the piece on his phone, sitting in the office chair where his father had sat for 33 years, with the receipt machine on the desk and the smell of oil and old coffee in the air. He set the phone down. He picked up the green composition notebook. He wrote, Tuesday, clear, DB 2/4 finished. First cohort midpoint reviews this Saturday. The boy found the timing issue again before I did. He capped the pen. He set the notebook by the phone. He went back to work. If something in this story settled in you, and I think it did, because you're still here, and something in you knows what it means to be read wrong by someone who wasn't paying attention, I want you to like this video. Share it with someone who needs it today. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the stories we tell here are not finished, and neither are you. And I want to ask you something right now. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who hadn't taken the time to understand what they were looking at? Who decided what you were before you'd had a chance to show them? Tell me in the comments. I need to hear it. We all do. But here's what really gets me. And I've been sitting with this since I first came across this story. It's not the engine starting. It's not Calder on his knees, though I'll be honest with you. I've watched the footage more times than I'll admit, and every time, something in my chest moves. What gets me is minute 11. Minute 11, under the chassis, in the dark, with both hands on the machine. The moment when Elijah Croft found the thing 3 other shops couldn't find. Not because he was smarter, not because he had better equipment or a better credential or a better anything that you can put on a resume, because he was still. Because he had been taught by a man who had been taught by 40 years of sitting with hard problems in a shop on a flat road in the Arkansas Delta, that the first thing you do is listen, that you do not arrive with the answer. You arrive with the attention, and you let the thing tell you. Calder arrived with the answer. The answer was incompetent. He'd decided that before he got out of the SUV. He was going to be wrong about it for 6 hours, and then he was going to be on his knees on a concrete floor, broken open by the sound of something he loved coming back to life, rebuilt by the hands of the person he'd dismissed. So here is what I want to ask you. The real question. The one I want you to answer honestly in the comments. What have you already decided about someone? What answer did you arrive with before you listened that might be costing you something you can't afford to lose? Because Calder almost didn't get to hear that engine. He almost sent away the only person who could fix it. He was 40 minutes and 1 sentence away from driving home with a car that never ran again. The engine was always going to start. The only question was whether the right person was going to be allowed to turn the key. Who are you not letting near the car?